this really will be a brief update on just a couple stories that I think are important. I'll go into more detail on them, on both of them on Sunday. I'm going to title this Russia Turns. So the two stories have to deal with a change in Russia policy relative to Syria in the Middle East that I think is pretty significant, and something that I just noticed this week about J Street, which claims to be a pro-Israel lobbying group, but it's not really pro-Israel. It's a left-wing group, and it does its best to make things difficult for the nation of Israel politically here in the United States. So let's look at the first story. The most important story is regarding the change in policy that appears to have taken place with regard to Russia. It comes from an Arab language newspaper, Asharq al-Awsat, that is published in London. And they had a front page article. It's here in the upper left-hand corner of the front page that you see on the screen, published a few days ago. And essentially, this is what the article says. In fact, there's a very good article in the Jerusalem Post by Seth Frantzman that lays out all the salient details as to what happened. Let me just share you a little bit of what Seth said in his article. He says this: Russia could be moving to pressure Israel to stop airstrikes in Syria. The policy of Russia has been for some time, much to the chagrin of its Iranian allies in Syria, that when there are missile factories or other shipments that are done by Iran and its proxies in Syria, Russia has pretty much allowed Israel to have relatively unrestricted access to bomb, to send missiles in, to send fighters in, to bomb these facilities. There have been some missteps along the way. If you remember, there a few years ago, there was a Russian plane shot down. I think there were 19 or 20 people on board that were killed. The claim by Russia at that time was that Israel was cloaking so the Syrians see the Israeli fighters coming on radar. They get their anti-aircraft batteries up and operational as this Russian troop plane is landing at an air base in Syria. And the allegation was, and the Russians did this very elaborate three-dimensional graphic to show what had happened, or what they claim had happened, was that the Israeli fighters were hiding behind the Russian plane as it approached for landing. In any event, I think Netanyahu worked very hard to overcome any of that fallout during the time that he was in power. He developed a pretty good relationship with Putin. And I think the combination of Netanyahu and Trump sort of kept Russia in check. I think there were things that Trump did during his administration that were contrary to these claims of Russian collusion and all this other nonsense. There are a couple things that Trump did that helped that were against Putin's interest. For example, I think that there are a couple things that Putin wanted when he went into Syria. He thought that he could get the rebellion calmed down very quickly. And here we sit 6 years later, and Syria is still a huge mess. But I think that Putin thought that he would get things calmed down, and then he would get the contracts to rebuild Syria, and it's going to take billions of dollars. I've heard the number is 50 billion, but if you've seen pictures of the damage to cities all across Syria, you know that $50 billion is just a drop in the bucket as to what it's going to cost. So I think there was a hope on the part of Russia that they would get those contracts. The problem, though, is who's going to pay that money? Certainly the Syrian people can't say that money. Their economy is in a shambles. We pretend that there's a country called Syria. Over half the people don't live where they did at the start of the Syrian civil war back in 2011. And it's interesting that today there are some reports of conflicts between the SAA, I think that's the Syrian Arab Army, which is a rebel group, and the Syrian army that is controlled by Assad. There were some conflicts between them around Dara in southern Syria. We were, as I've mentioned a number of times, we were actually in Israel in March of 2011, got up in the morning and found out that there were riots going on in conflict on the streets of Dara, which was really only 30 miles away from where we were. So here we were in peaceful Israel, and 30 miles away, the Syrian civil war was starting, and it continues to this day. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. There was a major drought in Syria for a number of years. It caused food prices to go up, and it lasted for several years. And so it kind of came to a head in March of 2011. That's when the Syrian civil war started. And we know the outflow of that. There's been a tremendous problem with there was the big refugee problem in Europe. I think that was done by design of the Russians and the Syrians to get people to move someplace and become their problem. And what they did was at least what I understand is they barrel bombed places that had rebel group leanings and caused those people to move somewhere else and become somebody else's problem. So it really was a kind of a cleansing of Syria of these opposition groups that were in opposition to Assad. But Assad still only controls a portion of Syria, and so we see here even today in the area where everything started, there are these conflicts. The SAA took control of some prisoners from the Syrian army and put them in custody and transported them. So Syria is still a mess. But so Putin wanted to get the contracts to rebuild Syria. I also think that Putin wanted control of the oil and gas fields in eastern Syria near Dar al-Zor, and also maybe because of the ethnic makeup, the western oil fields in the nation of Iraq. Well, between ISIS and the United States and a bunch of other people being involved, that has not happened. Well, what's happened recently is that Netanyahu is no longer the prime minister. There's a new foreign minister. There's a acting prime minister, whatever that is. I guess he's acting and playing at being prime minister. And it appears, though, that Lapid, through his position, Yair Lapid, through his position as, prime minister in waiting and the foreign minister, is causing a lot of problems. So back to Seth Frantzman's article in Monday's Jerusalem Post. Russia could be moving to pressure Israel to stop airstrikes in Syria. Reports began to surface this weekend, beginning with an article at London-based Asharq al-Assad that cited a well-informed Russian source. The report was carried in Turkey and other media in the region with interest. According to these reports, Russia might even strengthen the Syrian regime's air defenses. And what did the report say? The Russian source hinted at the possibility of, quote, closing Syrian airspace, unquote, to Israeli planes. The London paper reported, this comes in response to allegations that Israel has intensified their raids in the past 2 days against Iranian and Hezbollah sites in northern and central Syria. The attacks were not that successful. By most estimates, Russia, I believe, allowed Syria to use upgraded Syrian air defense missiles that shot down the Israeli missiles, I believe 7 of the 8, and that the damage was not that bad. But this is the reason for this. Russia released 2 statements in the wake of the raid, targeting a research center in the countryside of Aleppo in northern Syria, and the other on a site for Iranian forces to be stationed near Homs. This is a quote from the report. This is directly related to the talks which were launched with the United States following the first summit that brought together Presidents Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden last month. Moscow was calculating its reactions in the past because Tel Aviv is coordinating all its movements with Washington, while the Russian communication channels with Washington were cut off, and it appeared from the current contacts with the American side that Moscow obtained confirmation that Washington does not welcome the continuous Israeli raids. So there's quite a bit to unpack in that paragraph, but let me try to explain what I understand is going on. We know that the Biden administration has been completely backpedaling on just about everything that the Trump administration had done with regard to Middle East policy. Now, look, there were some problems with the Trump policy. I think there's a lot of people in good criticism that what he allowed Turkey to do in the Kurdistan region of northern Syria, southeastern Turkey, really is problematic, because the Kurds have always been allies of ours. Not sure who was running that policy or why it happened, but I think it was a blot on whatever Trump did. That's my personal opinion. And I think it's the opinion of a lot of other people too. But nevertheless, the U.S. presence, small as it was in Syria, was done as kind of a blocking maneuver against Russia becoming well-seated and allowing Iran to take more control and complete its land bridge from Iran through Iraq and Syria to the Mediterranean. In some respects, Russia doesn't necessarily want to see that happen, but Russia doesn't want to send massive amounts of troops into Syria. So Syria remains just this big mess. But we know that the Biden administration is reducing sanctions on the Iranians. And now it appears that, and it's also reducing sanctions on the Russians. One of the linchpins of Trump foreign policy was Trump blocking the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia to Europe. That will result in a lot of revenue to Russia from gas sales to Europe, and Europe relies on Russian gas. At the same time, of course, while the Biden administration is allowing the Russian pipeline to move forward and to be completed, it's shutting down pipelines here in the United States and Canada, and effectively cutting the legs out of the fracking industry that had developed under Trump, to the point where the United States was an independent oil gas power. That's all changed. The other thing that they have signaled to Russia, the Biden administration, that they don't really like Israel making these raids on Iranian targets in Syria. Part of that is because the linchpin of the Biden administration's foreign policy is getting this JCPOA agreement reinstated with Iran. And Iran is playing it. So they continue to bring materials, military and other materials, to build missiles and that sort of thing, and station them in Syria and Lebanon. Israel cannot allow that to happen. They already have a major problem with the number of rockets that Hezbollah has, should Hezbollah want to release those. So Russia is sort of flexing its muscles a bit and saying, okay, Israel, we had this policy under Netanyahu, but there's somebody new in town, and we don't really have a relationship. Putin doesn't have a relationship with Naftali Bennett or Yair Lapid. So we're going to allow Syria more leeway with our assistance to stop these Israeli airstrikes and control them more. As Seth continues in his article in the Jerusalem Post, this impression left space for Russia to act more freely in supporting Assad forces in Syria with more advanced anti-missile systems and know-how to make them more capable of shooting down Israeli armaments. This was also picked up by the Turkish media. Other reports said that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had asked Israel to provide Russia with information on any Iranian threats in Syria so that it could deal with them. The other thing that needs to be taken into account is what the Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid, dual-headed, two-headed prime ministership has done. And they went and adopted a policy with the United States that there would be no surprises. We're going to keep you informed of what we're doing. Netanyahu would inform the United States in many cases, but Netanyahu's policy and his government's policy was that Israel's going to act in its best interest. So we're going to do what we need to do. That has now changed. So Lapid and these guys have come in. I mean, as I mentioned last week, Lapid went to Europe and he's taking this position that, anti-Semitism is really just another form of racism, and he's muddying the waters on this despite long efforts that have been made by the Holocaust Remembrance Association to put in place a clear definition of anti-Semitism. Lapid's not undermining that. It also is clear that Israel's main economic relationship that is beneficial to it right now is through the Abraham Accord with the United Arab Emirates. And there's been a lot of advances, a lot of trade and exchanges of information and money and that sort of thing. Well, what Lapid did, though, was Lapid appointed a guy as the ambassador to the United Arab Emirates who was really against the Abraham Accords completely. And there's a big concern in Israel that among conservatives and the right wing in Israel, that this is going to undermine the Abraham Accords. And by extension, it would undermine any relationship that has been developing between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So very complicated. Here is what Seth says in his article. I'm just going to read it. You can read it. It's in the Monday, July 26th edition of the Jerusalem Post. Let's see. This leaves many questions. Is Russia sending a message to Israel, to the U.S., or is someone else trying to create controversy between Russia and Israel? What is the goal of Iran here, or the Syrian regime? It is known in the Gulf countries, as well as Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan, that they likely want the Syrian regime to be stabilized and stronger so that it can rejoin the network of Arab states in the region after having been kept out in the cold since 2011's Arab Spring. There's also concern that if things deteriorate any further in Syria, that there will be another wave of refugees. Jordan hosts well over 1 million Syrian refugees, and in a country of, I think, about 5 million people, Jordan can't afford it, and it's straining their resources, particularly these people up in a desert area. They need water. Jordan is already having water problems. So this is a developing situation, and I think it's pretty significant that Russia seems to have turned. It had, as I said, they allowed the Netanyahu government, I don't say they would say they had complete free reign, but they had a lot of leeway in what they were able to do. So I'll talk a little bit more about this on Sunday, but I think that this is something that needs to be watched. So here's the conclusion of Seth's article. In light of all this, the reports of July 24th about Russian views on Israeli airstrikes in Syria could either reflect a policy change or more of the same rhetoric as in the past. It could also be messaging to the U.S. and Iran. Pro-Iranian militias are increasingly operating in Syria and acquiring land and basing. A member of one of these brigades, a unit of Afghan Shiite fighters that works with Iran and Syria, was reportedly killed in recent airstrikes. Iran has been relatively quiet about this, but pro-Iranian militias in Iraq have been upping threats to the U.S. and its forces in Iraq and Syria. This could all be tied together. In the past, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq have accused Israel of airstrikes, illustrating that the issue of airstrikes in Syria, or what's known as the war between the wars campaign, is not just about Iran's role in Syria, but rather Iran's role in the wider region. So it's all very complicated, but I think a lot of it goes back to the Biden administration wanting to get this deal done with Iran. Iran's not even acting like they're interested now, but the Biden administration is falling all over itself trying to make concessions to Iran. That's not a good thing, and particularly at a time where it would seem that even modest sanctions on Iran might take down the Iranian regime, because they're having riots in Iran over water shortages. The Iranian government and the Revolutionary Guard have completely botched handling water resources in Iran, and people are thirsty and they're not getting water. They get very angry. So there are demonstrations all over Iran. The question is, how strong is the loyalty of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to the regime? Are the people that are there, are they eventually going to say, we've just had enough and we don't think the regime is going to last, and they turn on the regime too? That's usually how these revolutions will break through and have a change in government. So the Iranian regime, they see that they have to suppress this, and I think that the Iranian regime knows that its days may be numbered. So if they're going to make whatever pushes they want to make, I think that they're going to want to do them sooner rather than later. They have a demographic problem. They have a internal political problem. They have an internal economic problem. So their ability to operate is going to be very limited. So I'll talk more about this on Sunday, but I think it's a very significant development. And then the last thing, so this is a map of the Nord Stream 2. This is the head of the Russian military. So this is a very fluid situation. I think there's a lot development. Now, the other thing was there was a tweet the other day. This relates to the J Street thing that I wanted to talk about and conclude this with. It says this revelation from a classified Israeli foreign ministry cable on pressuring Ben & Jerry's over its decision not to sell in the occupied territories. Remember what I talked about last Sunday? Ben & Jerry said, we're not going to sell our ice cream, Ben & Jerry's ice cream. We're not going to allow it to be sold in Judea and Samaria. They'll say it can still be sold in Israel, and so there's been the Israeli government is really making a push to get Ben & Jerry's and Unilever, the owner of Ben & Jerry's, to change their mind on this. There was a report today that one of the big New York City, I don't know if he's a franchisee of Ben & Jerry's, a store owner of a bunch of Ben & Jerry's stores in New York City, has come out really opposed to this. So you can see that Israel's working to get this pressure on Ben & Jerry's and Unilever to reverse the decision. And you can see here's a bullet point from supposedly the cable, the secret cable that J Street, again, this ostensibly they claim to be pro-Israel, but they're not. They're a bunch of left-wing people. So here's what it said. Israeli diplomats were instructed to encourage Jewish organization pro-Israel advocacy groups and evangelical communities to organize demonstrations in front of Ben and Jerry's and Unilever offices and put pressure on investors and distributors for both companies. So what J Street is now saying, and this is the way the left operates, that because these evangelical groups or other pro-Israel groups would be doing advocacy on behalf of Israel to get Ben and Jerry's to change their mind, that they may be violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And I think you're going to see, unfortunately, I think you're going to see the Biden administration and the Department of Justice, which is just a political arm of the Biden administration, maybe go after these groups. We saw an example of this recently where one of Trump's friends and someone that's been close to Trump for years was charged with a number of felonies for being an unregistered agent for the United Arab Emirates. I think this is all connected together. So that's just a couple of things that are going on. I think these are rather significant things that are happening relative to Israel, geopolitics, and we'll talk more about this on Sunday. So like and share, subscribe, and we'll talk more on Sunday. Thank you.